Thank you, folks. So, as Joe said, I first came to Quarry Farm in the summer of 2022, and I was a little past graduate student and not yet faculty, which is the reality of so many people, right, in academia today. So I'm so grateful, right, to be back here sharing a little bit of the paper that I wrote on the porch just yonder a couple years ago. I'm also grateful for Joe and Steve and Matt, whose labors make possible all of our critical conversations with Twain, as well as my mom, who kept me company this week, and my partner back in Illinois, and our children and the questions that they ask, which you'll hear a little bit about in my talk tonight as well. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about the politics of illustrating children in Twain's Adaptation network. And we're going to start somewhere near you on a chair is a copy of this book, as many as I could find in Bloomington Normal, Illinois. So we can pass those around as we go. We'll take a look at some pages together across the way. It's hard to take the teacher out of the classroom. So Philip Stead and Erin Stead's The Purloining of Prince Oleomargarine, an adaptation of unpublished notes of a bedtime story that Mark Twain told his daughters, was published in 2017. Part fairy tale, part fictive meta-commentary about the process of the text construction. Purloining is the story of a young boy named Johnny. And Random House's summary of the book is as follows. Johnny, forlorn and alone except for his pet chicken, meets a kind woman who gives him seeds that change his fortune, allowing him to speak with animals and sending him on a quest to rescue a stolen prince. In the face of a bullying tyrant king, Johnny and his animal friends come to understand that the generosity, empathy, and quiet courage are gifts more precious in this world than power and gold. Absent, though, in this summary are the racial markers central to the Stead's adaptation. Moreover, Johnny's class position is framed tidily within the narrative arc and plot points of familiar fairy tale tropes. So tonight I'm going to explore the cultural scripts of class and race that are made visible in this adaptation, and I'm going to seek to contextualize the use of these scripts by offering close readings within other illustrations in Twain's Adaptation network. Adaptation studies scholar Kate Newell defines an adaptation network as the broad inventory of narrative moments, reference points, and iconography that gain visibility through successive adaptations. So tonight we're going to take a look at an 1885 illustration of Huck Finn, a used 1960s coloring book, and then the Purloining children's story as well. And we're going to ask, what do these illustrations require of the child in poverty? And what meaning is a child reader expected to make of these texts? And by focusing on illustrations, I'm borrowing some language from Gavin Jones's American Hungers, which talks about the body as the site that bears the marks, the damage of being poor. And so I'm going to use adaptation theory as a lens with which to read these texts because it makes visible intersectional differences that might otherwise go unnoticed and that show quite literally a precise hierarchy of class and race, even when authors and illustrators claim a politically neutral text. As we look at these representations across this adaptation network of illustrations, it asks us to move between different socially constructed concepts, such as race, class, gender, nation, and even childhood. Texts are always in circulation within a culture and within our language, and no audience reads a text in isolation. Meaning doesn't emerge in isolation from the objects we read, Newell writes, quote, but is shaped by the strategies we deploy and the interpretive communities to which we belong. So let's take a look at these illustrations. 7 years before The Purloining of Prince Oleomargarine was published, Twain scholar John Bird discovered the unknown manuscript at UC Berkeley. And knowing that Twain often told stories to his daughters, Bird contextualized the manuscript with aid from an unpublished notebook, which was entitled A Record of the Small Foolishnesses of Susie and Bay Clemens, in which Twain kept notes and stories of things his daughters said. Published in 2014 in this volume, edited by Benjamin Griffin, a record notes not only that Twain repeatedly told Susie and Clara stories while in Paris in 1879 of a boy named Johnny, but it also tells how those stories came to be. Twain would build a story from something nearby. Clara would go and get a magazine, perch herself on the chair arm, and seek out a suggestive picture, often something pretty odd, is how it was described. And so, Johnny, the story that we're going to look at tonight, this is what it looked like in Twain's notebook, and this is the original illustration from Scribner's in April 1879 issue, which is a pretty odd starting point for a children's story. So this illustration was admittedly only the launch to Twain's 5 days of Johnny stories. And it's understandably dissimilar from the Johnny that emerged in those stories and the Johnny that the Steads built in their book. But really immediately after this book was published, there was controversy in public media for a very different reason. Mathilde Rao's September feature in The New Yorker was built around Twain scholars' reactions to the Steads' book, particularly the decision to make Johnny black. For Bird, who discovered the manuscript, it was a surprising choice due to the lack of textual evidence, because Twain was, quote, not shy about dealing with matters of race. For Shelley Fisher Fishkin, a noted Twain scholar who has written extensively on race in Twain, it was not the plausibility of the choice that was paramount. Instead, it was that the children's book did not do justice to Twain's understanding of what it was like to be black in America. This choice, Fishkin is quoted as saying, quote, takes on the responsibility of thinking about how Twain would have viewed Johnny, a sentiment echoed by another person quoted in the story, the novelist David Bradley Jr., who said that the text should have at least been consistent with Twain's life and work. And then the author, albeit parenthetically, offers her own critique. The question of what it meant to be a black child in 1870s America is never directly addressed in the book. 21 days later, NPR also ran a story interviewing the Steads, largely built with questions from these Twain scholars' responses. And the Steads were very consistent with their earlier responses and collectively presented a narrative devoid of political intent. He was the kid I saw, Erin said. I think we're talking about it right now because we're living in a very politically charged time. Similarly, for Philip, 3 years ago when we began the project, it wasn't a political decision. Yet 3 years before 2014 was 1 year in a contiguous string of American history where race and the political were inseparable. August 2014 found citizens in Ferguson, Missouri protesting the murder of Michael Brown, an unarmed black teenager, by a white police officer. A month earlier, there was a children's book movement called We Need Diverse Books that was launched with the vision of a world in which all children can see themselves in the pages of a book. Philip goes on to say, if we had chosen a white character as the main character, I'm not sure we'd be answering these questions, as white children aren't asked to be symbols of anything. On the one hand, there's truth in that statement, as a child who is white is often read as the default in literature for children and adults. Children's literature scholar Philip Nell, the blue book on your left, cautions us, though, that, quote, whiteness makes itself invisible and appears to make race and racism vanish. Robin Bernstein's work, the middle book here, with 19th and 20th century material culture, talks about how, quote, childhood innocence, itself raced white, is characterized by the ability to retain racial meanings but hide them under claims of holy obliviousness, securing the unmarked status of whiteness and the power derived from that status. So white children, in fact, are asked to be symbols of something. So, of course, are Black children, and so are poor children. So my interest in the Stead's adaptation tonight is not in passing judgment about their choice to make Johnny Black. As noted earlier, Twain scholars that know far more than I do about Twain have weighed in about that choice. Instead, I'm interested in how their decision helps us reread and return to the child in poverty as an ongoing site of cultural negotiation, a site in which class and race are often conflated as they intersect in the body of a child. Building from the historian Natalia Molina's book and her ideas about the cultural scripts of race, she says that cultural scripts are enduring representations that shape how we see, experience, and imagine race. So how might this adaptation, this children's book, offer us a space to explore those intersections of race and class and childhood? Children's studies scholar Mara Gubar reminds us that if we equate childhood with innocence, then we idealize something unsustainable. So at the very least, centering the way a child's class and race prohibit access to a childhood of innocence must be a caution against a framework of childhood normed by white middle-classness. Adaptation theory, the study of the connections to and modifications and variations of a text across time, gives us a lens through which to engage this comparative work. Twain's most well-known child, immortalized in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, has become what the adaptation scholar Brian Rose calls a culture text, one of those things that everyone knows because of its pervasiveness. From a small chain of Midwestern gas stations, that's what they looked like when I was a kid. They're really fancy now. As well as children's book adaptations, games, comics. Huck is this malleable representation of American childhood. The historian Stephen Mentz, his book there on your left, his history of American childhood is called Huck's Raft. He says that for over a century, Huck has served as a lightning rod for popular fantasies and anxieties about childhood. More recently, Andrew Levy's book here on the right argues that, quote, Twain focused on the child as an autonomous figure in American culture, both fulfilling, right, and repudiating, pushing against stereotypes. So in short, when we see Huck Finn in popular culture, we don't need a footnote because we have a whole host of understandings in our cultural lexicon. A white child with freckles, ragged pants, a hat whose brim is no longer firm, and an easy, open smile. But of course, Huck Finn is itself an adaptation of the character of Huck Finn in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Life on the Mississippi, because the novel Huck Finn is both dependent and interdependent on those previous texts. Two different 19th century artists illustrated Huck Finn before one of the most famous illustrations, which you see here by E.W. Kemble. And it's this that's kind of become the touchstone for Huck. So if you look at the cover of the book we're focusing on tonight, at the bottom, you'll see Johnny. And if you look at Johnny alongside E.W. Kemble's Huck, you see similarities. A narrow build, brown pants, white shirt, suspenders, one or two, depending on the illustration, a hat, leather shoes, and carrying something that signifies a particular class position. And so when we look at these illustrations across time, it gives us a chance to unpack them and think about how they're in conversation with each other. Contemporary culture scripts Huck as white, just as early adaptations did. Yet, based on his surname, Finn, some have made the argument that Twain's Huck was Irish, which was then considered a dark race. Furthermore, Shelley Fisher Fishkin's work unpacks Huck's language to remind us that the vernacular roots of Huck's language and of American literature more broadly, are Black. So let's think about what illustrations do in a text. They explain, they clarify, And because not everything in a text can be illustrated, what is chosen for that illustration is also a way of adding emphasis and clarity to the prose. So we're going to read these illustrations tonight in a couple different ways, and also think about how children might be asked to read these illustrations. So first we're going to take a look at a coloring book, and I'll put this on the screen so that you can see it as well. So this coloring books are something children use, write, and play with, but it's also a really underutilized way to think about how children read and interact, and therefore make meaning with illustrations. So this mass-produced coloring book was published in 1960. It's an abridged text. This is not all of Huck Finn, right? But it's also, it shows us what the author or illustrator, we don't know because it's unnamed, decided about what to include and what color and what text to put on the bottom of the page. So my version of the coloring book here was owned by a 10-year-old girl in Gainesville, Georgia, who carefully labeled the front cover with her name, her address, and her birthday, which I chose not to project here on the screen for you. Each of the pages that are finished bears the child's careful signature, a signature that wasn't intended for me to see. Because this isn't from an archive, it was from a used bookstore. But this is a material artifact of children's culture that I think we can closely read. We can read these material objects as scripts, not to discover what any individual actually did, but rather as a way to think about what material objects invite their users to do. So Robin Bernstein talks about how reading material objects this way doesn't suggest that things possess agency or that people lack it, but instead to invite us to think about how, quote, agency emerges through constant engagement with the stuff of our lives. So what cultural script was the child invited into in this adaptation, in the Huck Finn Adaptation Network? And what was her response to it? So as you see on the cover, there is no Jim present on the raft. Huck is illustrated with freckles, reddish-brown hair, and his characteristic smile. And on page 9 in the coloring book, you see that the child chose to color Huck with exactly the same color of hair and exactly the same shade of skin. It's as though the child took, right, her inspiration from the cover of a coloring book, copying all the applicable identity markers of Huck. Another children's studies scholar, Karen Sanchez Epler, has a beautiful piece where she does a reading of a copybook that a child gave to their teacher in 1865. And she talks about how we often think of copying as mimicry, right? But she invites us to think about it a little differently. She invites us to think about how copying has been etched in our Western culture, quote, not only as a technology of self-expression and self-creation, but as a mechanism of collective memory and cultural preservation. So in each of the 5 pages that are colored in this coloring book, and of those pages that feature Huck, this child chose to recreate this picture again and again, including, where applicable, his red shirt and blue overalls. But there's another page that bears mention in this book. On page 40 of the coloring book, the child chose to color Jim primarily with a black crayon, his hands and hair shaded darker than his face and lips, and eyes which were colored with a brown crayon. There are no overt visible markers in the coloring book, no pre-printed shading on Jim's skin that was common in some coloring books across the 20th century. There's nothing that indicates Jim as black. Jim is not on the cover, which is the same front and back. I'm not suggesting, right, that all children colored Huck to match the cover or chose to color Jim's skin and hair in this way, but this child did. So what in this cultural text invited this child to color in this way? In her coloring of Huck, we see evidence of the coloring book script that was offered on the cover. In her coloring of Jim, we see evidence of a larger cultural script accessible to child in the text of the coloring book. She has made visible what it meant to be, and here I'm quoting from the words that are included in the coloring book, Jim, Miss Watson's slave, who overheard plans to sell him, and, quote, who was being hunted as a runaway slave. Those are the only 3 descriptions of Jim's enslavement in the 64-page text. So there's lasting power in the ways that Twain's novel has been visually represented both in cultural narratives of Blackness as represented in Jim, and in the ways Huck's body bears the tensions of his poverty, tensions that by this 1960 coloring book have become more visible since Kimball's 1885 rendering. So this copy of this coloring book makes visible how cultural scripts within an adaptation network affect the interactions of children with successive texts and images. So if we continue to read adaptations as one draft of many across time in an adaptation network, then the Stead's Johnny is in conversation with his coloring book and with Kimball's Huck. Illustrations of both children, Kimball's Huck and the Stead's Johnny, insist on the child's poverty, which bring to bear a network of signifying practices of inequality. Newell talks about how illustrations are pedagogical. They teach us. And so let's look together at some of the illustrations that are focused on the setting, Johnny's body, and Johnny's family that invite us as readers to consider how Philip Nell's framing of Huck Finn, which he calls a text in which race and class are interdependent phenomena, might also inform our reading of this children's book. So in other words, how do the illustrations of this book teach us, right, to read Johnny? More specifically, if Twain's original draft of the story did not describe Johnny as Black, how do we read Erin Stead's decision to illustrate Johnny as Black as perhaps a way for us to better understand his poverty? So I'm going to name a couple pages. Again, there's copies around the room. You're welcome to pass them around or hold tight to them. That's up to you. But it'll give you a chance to see some of these as well. So chapter 1 of Purloining begins on page 12 with Philip Stead inviting the reader to imagine the setting. And he frames the present assuming an American reader. He says, our land, the United States of America, is here, which he capitalizes, a place where, quote, everyone and everything is given a fair and equal chance, and where the luckless and hungry are likely to stub a toe, look down, and discover at their feet a soup bowl filled of gold bullion. That's never happened to me, maybe you. There, which he also capitalizes, on the other hand, is Johnny's world, which is our world too, I would argue, a place where, quote, the luckless and hungry remain luckless and hungry for all of their lives, and are likely to stub a toe, look down, and discover only the dried up, withered, old apple tree. This 4-paragraph juxtaposition of here and there with its anaphoric sentences is on the left page. And then on the right page, you see here nearly all white space with a single visually centered sentence that introduces the reader to Johnny. As we turn the page, we see an expanse of windswept soil, right? If you can see this illustration. And we see Johnny alone in this corner here, sitting with his arms and legs tightly tucked up. The cultural scripts of Johnny's poverty here echo common depictions of Depression-era rural spaces. A barren tree whose sideways growth suggests strong winds, eroding soil, and a simple shack framed by a bit of fence at places broken. This seems disconnected from the other settings in the text, a castle, a marketplace, and a forest whose trees and floor are a consistent green and which is full of healthy animals from diverse habitats. The story, both Twain's story and the Stead story, is of course a fairy tale, a genre not bound to one time or place. But the Stead's decision to begin with this particular image and these particular visual markers of Johnny's poverty is a choice specifically grounded in common cultural narratives of class, the isolating lack of the Great Depression, and America as a land of promise and possibility. Yet, while the reader is told early that Johnny is poor, it's not until a third of the way through the text, on page 48, that Johnny, after journeying 3 days to get to the castle, which is in a more urban and populated space, looks up at the castle wall and, quote, realized the shabbiness of his own self and that he couldn't ignore his hunger. We are once told in the book that Johnny smiled at his old friend, the chicken, but in no illustration in this book of Johnny is he smiling. As you flip through the pages, you'll see in every illustration he is stooped, hunched, unsure, hesitant, timid, cautious, small, and fragile. His smallness is insisted upon page after page, as he usually occupies a small corner or portion of this oversized book. Twain's draft of the story does have Johnny ask the animals at one point, "What do I do next?" But there's not a single bit of characterization in Twain's manuscript that suggests the string of adjectives in my previous sentence. In fact, the few times that Twain records dialogue for Johnny, he speaks directly and with confidence. "Protect my witnesses and await results," he tells the king in Twain's story. In this way, Twain's Johnny's speech is more direct like Huck's, though not marked with the vernacular as Huck's is. And I'm not suggesting that the Steads should have created a Huck, or that a child who is timid and hesitant and cautious is somehow bad or inauthentic. However, I am asking us to think about what cultural scripts informed these illustrations and the deviations from Twain's original story. The most powerful of the negotiations that takes place in Purloining involves Johnny's family and later his access to a surrogate family. So this is Twain's original story. Twain's notes begin with the phrase, "Widow, dying, gives seeds to Johnny." The seeds had been given to her by an old woman, quote, to whom she had been kind, and whom the widow believed was a fairy. And Twain's second paragraph is as follows. She died. Johnny was all alone all winter and nearly starved, humiliated and sometimes kicked by neighbors when he begged a crumb. We're not privy to what Johnny and the widow's life was like before her death. However, we're told that the seeds were to be planted only in dire distress, and those seeds had never been planted. Twain's framing of the story also suggests that before the widow's death, Johnny had never begged for food, implying that the resources, though meager, sustained them. We're not told whether the widow is Johnny's mother, grandmother, aunt, relative, acquaintance, but it's clear that she cared and provided for Johnny, even giving him something that upon her death might sustain him. The Steads, however, choose to conflate the widow and the fairy into an old blind woman outside the king's castle who comes upon a crying Johnny. Remember a minute ago when I said it's a third of the way through the book when he realizes the shabbiness of his own self. First, the widow and the fairy combined into this old blind woman asks for alms. Then she gives Johnny the magical seeds. And in the next illustration, she kind of sprouts these dragonfly wings, and it's revealed, right, that she's a fairy. And then Philip Stead brings Twain back into the story as a character at this point, which in some ways helps us know that this is moving a little closer to Twain's original story. But there's a big difference. On page 58, Stead writes, "She did not die," talking about the old woman. Then on page 60, Twain, the character, says to Philip, the author, who is also a character, "Surely the old woman is dead." Philip disagrees, remains silent, and then it says his mind began to drift as the character Twain delivers a monologue about why it would be the proper thing in the story at this time for this to happen. So Philip tells the reader, My mind drifted as he described the barrenness of the land Johnny returned to and the hunger that still gnawed. It drifted as he described the whipping Johnny received. And it drifted as he described Johnny's grandfather, who took the seeds, chewed them up and spat them on the ground, kicked up a clod of earth, and let fly a volley of obscenities. So the character Philip, the author of this book, his mind drifts when the character Twain is describing Johnny's poverty and the suffering that he endures. But as an author, Stead puts the change in Twain's mouth. Not only does this adaptation erase the nurturing maternal figure that this child had, but she's replaced with a grandfather whose similarities to Pap Finn we can quickly catalog. Huck tells us in Huckleberry Finn, "I was all over welts. He cussed me for putting on frills and trying to be better than him. He chased me round and round the place with a clasp knife." In this book, for Johnny, quote, "His poor wretched grandfather swore often enough for the both of them, and his cursings hung over like a cloud over their unhappy home." Stead's denominalization, cursings, not only makes a noun a verb, something the child endured, but then invites it back to its noun form again, giving it permanence in the atmosphere of the home. Then, of course, there's Stead's choice of language for the violence that Johnny endures, whipping. In the illustrations of Purloining, the reader sees Johnny's grandfather's violence in silhouette twice. One is on page 60 and 61. So you can see the silhouette of that violence. We only see Johnny, hands clasped behind his back, as witness to it, even though in the text it's described that he receives the whippings. So after Johnny buries his grandfather, he follows the instructions for the remaining seed, and this is when he goes to the castle, and the story becomes more like a fairy tale. But in the second half of the book, Johnny encounters 3 surrogate families. The first are the anthropomorphized animals who arrive when he goes into the wilderness, and they immediately begin to care for him, feed him, build him a warm home, and prepare a banquet. And Stead actually gives us a whole paragraph that describes this meal, from Johnny's first bite to how he ate till he was full, and tells us for the first time everything was going well for this child. So this is page 88 and 89, where you see the animals, and again, here's Johnny in the corner. And you can see that though Johnny is small on the page, the animals in these illustrations bend and lean and look to him with love and care. But the story abruptly shifts and he's not allowed to stay. The second possible surrogate family Johnny encounters is the king and queen. There's a handbill that offers a return and a reward for their son, Prince Oleomargarine, and it attracts the attention of Johnny and the animals. So they go to the court, and the king speaks very cruelly to Johnny, and the queen gives him a red scarf that you see around his neck in the rest of the book. We don't see the king and queen again, but even though Johnny finds Prince Oleomargarine, as described on the handbill, we don't see Johnny receive the reward of, quote, money, a princess, and a home in the palace for life. Johnny tells us in the book, money seemed like a very nice thing to have, but Susie the skunk, notice the name of the skunk, describes that Johnny did not need money, a princess, or a home. Instead, if he could complete the journey that he was on, Susie says, he, quote, would have the courage and the bravery to continue on his own. While I wouldn't want the king to be the father of any child, Erin Stead's illustrations of the queen indicate her kindness. Regardless, by having the kind animals tell the reader that Johnny didn't need the money to have his basic needs met, the security the reward could have provided is removed, and offered instead is a narrative of self-reliance. The final family that Johnny encounters in the book are the somber-faced giants who have purportedly stolen the prince away from the castle. In fact, the giants are common people from the village who have refused to bend before the king. and who live in a cave as exiles. Stead's careful placement of the giants' bodies is remarkable, and you'll see this near the end of the book on pages 138 and 39. And so on this page, what I want us to pay attention to at the top, these are the giants, right? The community. There are children amongst these illustrations. And if you look closely, all of the children in this spread, this 2-page spread, have someone carefully and purposefully touching them or willingly receiving their touch. They're illustrated as safe and as protected and as part of a community. So this contrast of the way these children are represented makes the contrast of the next action in the story even more abrupt. So Prince Oleomargarine leaves the cave with a tiger. Any predictions on what happens? Dinner, yes, dinner, exactly. So the violence, though, of the prince's death being eaten by a tiger is unstated and unillustrated. Meanwhile, we have several illustrations of the violence, right, that Johnny has received in the book. After the prince's exit, the giants in the cave ask if Johnny is going to tell their secret place or if he hates them. And this is what Johnny says in the book. Johnny took a deep breath to calm his nerves. Then he opened his mouth and discovered the words that could save mankind from all its silly, ceaseless violence. If only mankind could say them once in a while and make them truly meant. He said, "I am glad to know you." This narrative of words that could save if we could but say these words feels especially weighty for the child without a home, without money, without a family, to bear the burden of saying. Furthermore, Twain's original story ends at the cave. Neither those words or this resolution is something that Philip Stead carried forward from the original. The Stead's adaptation was published in 2017, but this is one of many texts in a long line of American literatures in which the families and communal support systems for Black children are erased, remain unimagined, or instead are constructed with racist cultural narratives. This is well documented by scholars who study Black childhood in the 19th century. Recently, for example, Bridget Fielder's 2020 Relative Races catalogs common cultural narratives that catalogs common cultural narratives in that time, such as presumed maternal failures of Black women and the paternalistic arguments from both those fighting to uphold the system of slavery and those working to dismantle it, arguments that, quote, claimed that white people were proper caregivers to Black people. Her powerful book disrupts that. Furthermore, Crystal and Webster's 2021 Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood recovers historical records of antebellum Black families' activism in direct response to, quote, a historical discourse on Black parenting, especially motherhood, that infringed upon African Americans' rights to maintain custody of their own children. So the Stead's adaptation of Johnny both erases a nurturing maternal figure in Twain's original and replaces that figure with a grandfather akin to Pap Finn, thus aligning their adaptation with long-established deficit cultural scripts of Black childhood. Furthermore, despite 3 hopeful moments with surrogate families, no one within those families in the narrative seems overly concerned with offering this child a permanent home. In the middle of the same page of this book where Johnny musters up the courage to say the words that could save mankind, Philip Stead pauses the story before we, quote, find an answer for Johnny in order to describe one more difference between here and there. First, Stead's choice to name Johnny's language at the climax of this book as found by the author suggests 2 things. One, it tells us that it's the author's move here, right, to name this as the moral of the story. But it also suggests Johnny's inability to respond himself to that particular moment, that his answer had to be found for him. So by evoking the supposed to be ironic here and there, Stead suggests in the book that all Johnny needs, one of the most important things around, is, quote, a true friend. So the chapter ends with the sentence, "The giants wept." And we don't know whether Johnny returns to his grandfather's cabin alone, or to the forest with the animals, or stays in the cave with the giants, or is miraculously somehow invited to occupy the queen's sliver of silent kindness in the castle. The reader is offered only a 2-page, 3-sentence epilogue in which we learn that Johnny's original chicken companion lived to be 100 years old. But there's no word of Johnny. What meaning is the child reader invited to make here? Purloining isn't about Prince Oleomargarine any more than in the end it's about Johnny. Mama, my own 7-year-old daughter, asked at the end of our reading of this book, "Where can Johnny go now?" This is a gorgeously illustrated book. It tries to be a careful book in many ways, though it stumbles significantly in its execution of that care. It's a book that wants to take very seriously the task of writing alongside Twain. But ultimately, for me, it's a book about what I call the cultural labor of the poor child. How do these illustrations prompt us to read Johnny? His blackness, it seems, is supposed to inform our understanding of his poverty, the one defining constant from Twain's notes to the Stead's adaptation. In other words, this text is, just as Huck Finn is, a text in which racial status underwrites class status. We cannot know what made Erin Stead say he was the kid I saw. More important, however, is what meaning a child reader is invited to make from her illustrations. Who in this book has access to a childhood where their basic needs are met? How do tensions of race and class inform the ways childhood emerges in this book as a site of cultural negotiation? 2 months after the New Yorker and NPR pieces were published, in the New York Times, Gopnik flippantly dismissed the puzzlingly controversial choice to illustrate Johnny as black, as it suggests that it's possible to create controversy about anything. He states that this choice was mysteriously apt, and then references the earlier interviews and says that Erin Stead convincingly explained that the decision was not politicized. He closes his paragraph with 2 more sentences that kind of absolves, in his mind, the Steads of their choice in this particular text. He says, "The story in any case clearly set in not America in the 1870s or any other time, but in that different nameless realm. And so the choice does what casting of this kind ought to do, make us aware of the humanity of the protagonist first and of his identity only after. How soon after we have been made aware of the character's humanity, we should become aware of his or her identity is a proper subject of controversy, and right away is one reasonable answer, but the order in which we discern the two should not be prescribed." Gopnik's rhetorical move to separate humanity and identity is perplexing and illogical, even within the structure of his own argument. It seems his argument is that because the story is not set in America, but in a nameless realm, which page 12 contradicts, the reader's not justified in making meaning from the text's racial scripts. Yet Gopnik proposes that the Stead's choice to illustrate Johnny as black, what he calls casting, quote, makes us aware of the humanity of the protagonist first and his identity after. If the casting of Johnny as black lends the character his humanity, how is that separate from his identity, a word that Gopnik uses to signify race? In her illustrations, Erin Stead evoked cultural scripts of race, precarious and vulnerable black children, to invite a young reader to have sympathy for Johnny, an orphan child in whom a reader is invited to correlate poverty with ignorance, silence, and an acquiescence to the choices of others. Gopp nicknames Erin Stead's choice as making visible Johnny's humanity. However, the implications of this choice do not, in fact, extend humanity to Johnny. Instead, we get further insight into what Molina calls, quote, the condition under which racial scripts emerge, the social structure, the material conditions, and the historical context, which demonstrate, what I would say, the ways that class and race are conflated, a process far older than they're here or there. Levy argues that Twain was more radical in his views of childhood than in his views of race. He says, quote, Twain was focused on the child as an autonomous figure in American culture, again, both fulfilling and pushing against stereotypes. In the end, then, Johnny is not a child at all, at least not a child of Twain's. The oft-debated end of Twain's novel finds Huck lighting out for the territory. Johnny's story ends in flux. Huck is running from something. Johnny doesn't get to choose. Perhaps poor children, laden with cultural scripts, exist in our literature and cultural texts as sites where we work out competing narratives of what it means to be a child and what it means to be poor, to be Black, to be white. These, then, I argue, are texts representative of the cultural labor of the poor child.